Dina's session. So Dina Babushkina is an assistant professor at the University of Twente, Netherlands, and she is specialized in philosophy of technology, AI ethics, also history of philosophy, moral psychology, and normative ethics. And we have known each other for a long time because Dina used to be in University of Helsinki. And we also worked in the same research group called Radar. So that was also about these same topics, philosophy and ethics of AI. And her title today is Narrative Self-Repair and the Epistemic Other. So please, Dina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, P, and thank you, Julian and the Lemon Tree, for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here, to see you all, to get connected, and to learn about the work that you're doing. Hope for the more to come. P, thanks. Have not much to add to how you characterized me. Maybe one thing is that we're also working a lot on existentialist themes. And the existentialist perspective influenced quite a bit kind of my approach to the philosophy of psychology, which I think will be obvious quite soon. So the Sphinx on the background is not accidental. So it's a photo of an actual Sphinx from the cemetery in Athens. So there's a good chance that when Athenians back then were, reciting the theatrical play about Oedipus, that's the image of the Sphinx they had, and the puzzle that the Sphinx is presenting, something that I think runs through the idea of trauma and the therapy and the way perhaps how we should look at it. So I left AI purposefully out of the title. It is there in the epistemic other, and the general question I want to ask is whether the AI can be that epistemic other for us in the narrative self-repair or in this self-reconstruction that happens as a part of recovery from traumatic experience or not. My answer would be that it's not. It's not so straightforward, but just to give a snapshot of my position. And everything I do in the philosophy of AI, especially in application to psychology and psychotherapy, is trying to capture that and preserve that unique human perspective that is both what makes us have traumatic experiences and what allows us to recover. Okay, and it used to work. Okay, it works. So what I will be talking about is partially sort of thinking aloud because I'm still trying to kind of, for myself, conceptualize what I mean by epistemic other. Okay, but I will be trying to bring together two perspectives, which one of which is that we developed with Bastebor in a paper on the kind of role of conversational agents in the therapeutical dialogue, and another perspective comes from something that is currently sort of under revisions. It's submitted and it's under the revision, and that paper focuses on the problem of ethnicity and the problem of simulated narratives. So the both perspectives that I'm trying to conjoin, they fit very well with the talks that we had today. So I'm very thankful to the presenters that were before me, which I think paved very nicely the ground for the kind of things I want to talk about. Right, so I want to start with the hype. So one of the appeals of conversational agents, and conversational agents are AI-based, right, tools for therapy support. So one of the appeals of integrating conversational agents into the therapeutic context is the idea that they can engage in a dialogue. And some even suggest that they can function as replacements for the spontaneous conversations that you're having with the therapist. So I have this little quote which I especially like, and it goes like this. So to integrate AI in the form of conversational agents into platforms, so we can integrate AI as conversational agents into platforms, or CAs can take on the role of psychotherapist, giving constructive feedback and posing clinically informed inquiries such as Socratic questions that could directly help the client when analyzing negative automatic thoughts and maladaptive core beliefs. So in itself, I don't think there is anything new here for our audience, but for me what is specifically interesting is Socratic dialogue mentioning in this context, because I'm a philosopher, my background is in philosophy, and when somebody mentions Socratic dialogue, I have a very specific understanding what that means. And what that means is kind of the highest order of engagement of the mental investment, right, into consideration of some problem. So this quote is presupposing that we are talking about the most complex and vast forms of the dialogue that requires this considerable mental work and the high-level cognitive skills, right, working towards a specific goal. And so what worries me is that the suggestion is that conversational agents are capable of this kind of meaningful engagements, like meaningful conversations with the patients, to the effect of reaching insights and deep understanding, and thus addressing patients' problems by affecting them in a goal-oriented way, the patterns of thinking, self-reflection, feeling, and action. So the promise of CAs in psychotherapy, for me, is associated with this kind of substitution, I will call it substitution trap, right? And again, my point would be not that we cannot use conversational agents in whatsoever way in the therapy. I'm interested in the most specific question of where does the limitation lie? Where does the limit lie? So more in the cases where we cannot use conversational agents in psychotherapy. And that's why I'm asking a question whether AI is a meaningful alternative in terms of therapy goals, right? So what matters for therapy patient as a patient in the therapy process, so I call this analytical concern, and what are patients justified in expecting from therapy process, and that's more like normative concern. So I hesitate to call it ethical concern, because in the ethics of technology is understood in a particular way, but if you look at it as a broadly moral philosophy perspective, that's also a valid moral concern. And so the appeal of conversational agents in their ability to engage in this kind of rich, meaningful dialogue, life-changing dialogue, forces to ask a question whether they possess the abilities which are necessary for the kind of cognitive involvement that is needed in the emotional, the bodily, and the behavioral changes that a therapeutic process aims at, right? So are we justified to believe that CAs are capable of such engagement? So my point would be that, we have reasons to doubt that they possess such abilities. I'm not alone, of course, in this. So there are a number of authors that point to essential connection between the necessary interpersonal kind of dialogical or conversational skills which then relate to what we expect from the human agents in a meaningful conversation and a meaningful therapeutic dialogue, and the success of the therapeutical dialogue in the end. And that kind of doubtful connection leads to the problem of kind of, Sidakova and Trashel call it mimicking, I call it simulation of the dialogue. And so the question is, to which extent the simulation is enough for the goals that we have in therapy? I believe that the previous speaker also, Arthur, mentioned the frustrated expectations, and the simulation is something that gives rise to the wrong expectations, because when you enter the therapy with certain justified expectations from your conversational partner and they are not able to deliver, then the whole process is not conducive to the goals of the therapy. So I mentioned simulation, and for the purposes of the kind of perspective that I'm developing, I'm looking at AI and conversational agents as essentially cognitive simulators. So the simulation of the dialogical event, which is, as we have mentioned today, largely understood as reducible to kind of linguistic manipulations, right, formalistic linguistic manipulations, is a consequence of artificial intelligence original project as a simulation of cognition, right? Started as a simulation of cognition. So I have been working on this topic for a while. I'm not going to go too much into this at the moment. But in order to make the question more concrete, we can ask, to what extent are simulations of dialogical interactions conducive to the therapy goals, and to what extent are they acceptable, right? So both the normative perspective and analytical perspectives. When is simulation detrimental to these goals, and when should it be therefore avoided? So in one of the kind of inspirational texts for search that I've been doing came from texts like Bryson's Aftermath. I don't know if you are familiar with the book. I highly, highly recommend it. So Bryson is a philosopher herself, and she is working with the concept of the self based on her own experience of physical abuse and being left to die. And so I use that kind of text, as well as a number of self-disclosure narratives from abuse victims, in order to delineate those complex situations where where we can find the meaningful breakage of the expectation that if you have a certain certain algorithmic flow, that will lead you, to the resolution. So, and this is where the existential perspective comes in. So what I'm kind of arguing for is that we need to construe trauma as an existential situation. And if we do so, then the limitation of AI becomes sort of painfully apparent. What I mean by existential situation, well, it's not such an easy thing to define, but what I mean by that is a situation, it's a lived situation, it's a situation where you're being confronted with the boundaries of your own humanity. Yeah, so it's a situation where you experience a certain rupture, sort of disruption in the fabric of the familiarity, right, when the world is no longer looking the same. So these are the situations where one is sort of brought to oneself, if you can say it that way, when one has to face oneself, work with understanding what oneself is. Usually it happens after sort of significant events such as death or violence, And it's a time when, you know, people ask big questions and when they feel the need in the therapy. So why am I approaching it this way? Is because I'm trying to delineate cases where, you know, where there is a genuine need in a therapeutic repair, and where as other kind of activities can help person to heal, right? So not every situation calls for a therapeutic intervention or in kind of rebuilding of oneself. So there are different. So the traumatic events come on kind of with on a scale of intensity and a scale of complexity. And the more complex they are, the less it is evident that you can get away with the simulating experiences. So trauma then is a lived experience, and that's very important. So it's a lived experience of this existential situation. It's immersive, it's inseparable from the agency, inseparable from the history of how it's been lived through. And therapy is then a way to cope with this existential situation, sort of. In the Bryson's case, it's a rape and sort of attempt to be, I don't know how to say that properly in English, so being left to die. Bryson calls that mastery of trauma. Yeah, so you have to make it your kind of also your own experience. And from patient's perspective, being trauma is a from the patient's perspective, therapy is a transformative undertaking in dealing with this existential challenge, and therefore therapy itself is an existential experience, existential situation. So this is kind of an extract from the paper with Bass, and in this extract what we do is that we define existential situations as the disruption in the initial structure of everyday life, when you no longer feel at home in the world that is surrounding you, the you know, people that are surrounding you, and the existential situations is not something that are alien to our human nature. It's a part of what it means to be human, so one cannot escape living through such episodes. And what is interesting from therapeutic point of view and also psychological point of view, which existentialism probably is missing to a certain extent, is that they are essentially paradoxical, in a sense that they make us understand that there are kind of determinations in life that are not under our will, like the events like death or violence occur whether we want them or not. But at the same time, they reveal that the way we experience and deal with those events is determined by how we understand the world and our place in it. So it's a lot in our hands. So the existential perspective allows to construe both trauma and therapy as fundamentally experiential, and that means that we are looking, for example, at abuse as an experience of an abused person, somebody experiencing certain emotive attitudes and certain thought patterns, right? It also gives us the sort of idiosyncratic perspective. Idiosyncratic perspective becomes important because it is the person's own response to the kind of those all humans events that are an integral part of our way of being in this world. But it also means that when we are dealing with a traumatic experience, we are dealing with a certain person. For example, being abused by a certain other person, yes, it matters who that person is. In a certain situation, it matters what situation it was. And we look, for example, at the emotions and the cognitive patterns of somebody who's suffering an abuse as therapeutically conductive when we work towards the understanding of their subjective experience. So we cannot bracket those things out. And what is also specifically important for me, especially when we're trying to understand what large language models are doing, is the understanding of lived experience as associated with individual is symbolic, right? In the sense of what a certain happening, certain item, certain phenomena means for me. And that's the part which the language models are unable to reach, since they are working with the formal rules of discourse. So the existential perspective gives me another benefit, in that it allows to set the criteria of judging what matters for the patient as a patient in the therapeutic process. It allows to put the center of attention on the self, right? As it is experiencing a certain existential situation, as it is undergoing the transformation for therapy. So it allows to keep that focus of attention on the patient's own recovery goals, which of course are constituted together with the therapist, but they are always the patient's own goals, not the goals of the therapist themselves. And this is where I see central role for the narrative, because it's the tool and the media for the interpretative work essential to dealing with trauma. So what makes a situation existential is my experience of it. So the getting stuck in the traumatic experience is being trapped in a self-destructive narrative, right? And I'm talking here more of the example of abuse. That's what I have in my mind. So of course, not all situations are the same. And coping with an existential situation involves being able to reintegrate the disruption that the self has experienced into this novel structure of familiarity through rebuilding the self-narrative. And the conversational therapy is essentially, for me, is essentially a guided way of rebuilding the narrative. So it's the work of the self on the self. And therefore, the role of the I call them patients. So the role of the patient, the role of the therapist in the conversation are extremely important for understanding, how the success in the therapeutic process is being achieved. Sorry, I have to move the bar with icons back and forth. That's why there are a little bit interruptions. I cannot move it away from my text. So where I see the danger of AI is in the potential to dehumanize the therapeutic process by shifting attention to the simulated, to the merely behavioral, to generalizable and the statistical, offering the preconstructed coherence that bypass one's own longing for authenticity and meaningfulness, right? So this preconstructed coherence of the narrative and the entire kind of therapeutic process through the dialogue. And cases like Bryson give me an understanding that nowhere it is more consequential than in recovery from trauma, where the symbolic work of therapy requires that symbols refer to idiosyncratic, subjective, lived psychic contents. We cannot afford losing them, because then we'll lose the entrance to the individual, right? To the lived experience of the certain event by this specific person rather than some other person. So and to the existential weight of what an event meant for a particular me. Yeah, rather than to the likely types explicit in the statistical linguistic regularities. So, and LLMs are at odds with the unique existential dimension of trauma as something that becomes semantically specific only in a particular lived experience. That is to say, as something that unfolds from the subjective point of view in otherwise objectively determined sequence of the events. Yeah, so now I want to move a little bit more to discussing cognition and intersubjectivity and also the epistemic dimension of it. So, self-repair requires the transformation of one's self-narrative. Yeah. So, but it's often impossible from within the existential situation itself. So whenever you get locked in the traumatic experience, you cannot, that's the whole point, that's why you need the therapy, because you cannot get the perspective from outside. And so in that case, this is why we need a therapist. I call the therapist the objective other, the objective in the sense that they are outside of the traumatic loop, traumatic trap, and also outside this kind of shattered self-narratives. So this is a complex interaction that involves renegotiation of things that are important and meaningful, but also revealing and changing in certain patterns, right? Not only of thought, not only of emotion, but also of behavior. And this interaction enables the use of the first-person narrative as an interpretative tool, right? A tool that helps to know what happened, how the objective events disrupted the inner world, and thus to find ways to amend the damage. As a means to focus attention, analyze, understand, the therapeutic dialogue is also an epistemic tool. And I was really excited to kind of see the similar conclusion in Bryson, who says that understanding trauma requires one to take survivors' first-person narrative seriously as essential epistemological tool. And so, okay, I'll go briefly through this one. But my point, focusing on simulation of cognition with respect to AI and psychotherapy, I aim to bring moral concerns about this kind of substitution. So what I'm trying to say is that within the therapy context, we are warranted to have moral concerns about the very essential goal of AI, which is to simulate and substitute cognition. And the existential perspective gives us the context to understand why these moral concerns are valid. It enables us to see them as concerns about intervention, such as rooted in the cognitive agency of the patient herself. And by understanding how AI changes, works on, and interacts, substitutes cognitive elements in the hermeneutic agency, in the epistemic agency of the patient, helps us also to understand how we need to guide the use of AI in therapy. So I don't think it's a surprise for anyone here, but I have to say this when I'm talking to philosophers of technology. But the dialogue is essentially a tool for guided work in self-narrative. So it helps to deconstruct and reconstruct through reconnecting certain time slices of oneself, connecting me here with me then through memory and kind of subjective imagery. And as such, therapeutic dialogue requires a lot of cognitive work. Just a few examples. For example, decoding. That's a typo. So decoding of deep symbolism, right? Which is a considerable cognitive investment. It can last months. It can last years. Rewriting the invasive self-script, such things as, you are unworthy, nobody cares about you, which is a very frequent thing in the narcissistic abuse. Reconceptualizing the scripts of archetypes to exclude abusive elements, so rewriting what mothering or fathering oneself entails, as well as identifying and disabling certain triggers that exist in the linguistic sphere as well. And that brings me to the role of the epistemic other, because the therapist in the dialogue requires considerable cognitive and emotive investment. We talked a lot today about empathy, but I don't think that empathy, even though it's important, but I don't think it's the only key element in a dialogical relationship or therapeutic relationship with a therapist. It's also about the ability to relate on the existential level, to provide that outside the trauma kind of trap perspective needed for interpretative, reconstructive, and action guiding interpretative work on the self-narrative. And that's what makes therapies the epistemic other. So it's the I don't have it so far a very good definition of epistemic other, but what I mean there is that, you know, it's the other that not only mirrors, not only co-creates, not only helps to work with the situation, but somebody who loans their own cognitive effort in understanding what was so traumatic about a certain episode, and of course also providing validation and recognition, which are extremely important.
Dina, just letting you know, you have 10 minutes and 30 minutes in total.
Okay, cool, thanks. So what we concluded with Bas is, well, we didn't conclude it, it was probably our starting point, is that therapeutic dialogues are not just conversations, right? So you cannot imitate the shape and form of a conversation and then hope that it will achieve those complex epistemic goals that a therapeutic dialogue has. So given the epistemic dimension of therapy, therapeutic dialogue is a way to discover, determine, and categorize, as in putting a name on things which are phenomenologically non-transparent to somebody in traumatized situation. And they are the ways of this guided transformation of the self through intersubjectivity. So we cannot remove intersubjectivity part from the objective other or the epistemic other in the therapeutic dialogue. It's itself an existential situation as much as it is an epistemic and semiotic process dealing with deep symbolism, but this is something you live through. You live through it the same way as you, not the same way, but you have to live, you have to experience it yourself as scratch that sentence, because however I try to finish it, it has bad implications, so I'm going to finish that. But then anyway, so it is a goal-oriented, invested interaction towards an interpretation and clarity in somebody's situation. So one kind of very briefly, why intersubjectivity? I think again Bryson offered a very interesting perspective there. And it also is quite, the same point is quite evident from the reports that we have from narcissistic abuse victims, is that the intersubjective element is essential because of the nature of the traumatic experience. So traumatic experience is itself intersubjective in nature. It happens in intersubjective space. The violation is fundamentally relational in character, and therefore the kind of healing, the kind of repair that needs to be happening to amend that is in a sense also reconstructing the possibility of intersubjectivity itself from the beginning, right? It's a process that needs to reconstruct the possibility of having that kind of relationship with others. And I'm trying to go very briefly, that's my last section, through the reasons why I believe the simulation is not enough. What I want to make sure is that I'm not saying that all simulation is necessarily wrong. This is an objection I very frequently hear. The problem, however, is whether the simulation is suited for driving the therapeutic dialogue as a means to dealing with existential situation, right? When we do have that kind of rupture. So Bryson talked about the dissonance in the survivor's experience. So what she makes very clear is that there is a potential for re-traumatization from certain generic responses that fail to appropriately acknowledge and validate the lived experience of the existential situation, the way that folded in my phenomenological space. So she mentions, things like cliche responses or dismissals, or platitudinal statements, which were very, very traumatic and kind of hindered her coping with the trauma. And what I hear in this is a failure of the objective or the epistemic other, failing to engage with and address the victim's message and testimony, For example, by substituting them with a generalized preconception of what the experiences should be. So I'm not going to go through Bryson's quote because just to save some time, but where I'm getting with that is the idea that conversational agents cannot substitute the role of the other, the objective or the epistemic other, in the therapeutic relationship, because of the complexity of the role that the therapist as the objective other is playing in the recovery. And that role is determined by not only the externality as in the objective other, but also in their equality in vulnerability, right? And the fact that they have the same existential stakes as the victim that help to unlock why the violation was so traumatic that it hinders, the ability to cope with social life. And this is where the part of the other in the objective other comes in. And it also comes, the complexity of their role also comes from the epistemic grounding which they provide to the search for the truth about oneself, among other things, anchoring the confirmation of what is real, right, and what is hostile, what is promoting my well-being, and what I actually in the end am, right, and what I'm not. So the artificial agents lack all of those. I hesitate to say the word capacities, but I don't have a better one. So they scrap certain data carriers, and they create the platitudinal lines that are unable to adapt to the complexity of lived experience. And again, I'm purposefully being in a comfortable ground because I'm talking about complex cases, right? And they risk re-traumatizing when they fail to provide the sufficient support as the objective other is supposed to. Let me see. Yeah, so this is my last slide. So AI never responds to you. It responds to typical requests. It is limited to the range of texts that it has been exposed to. So if your case happens to differ in significant aspects to those texts, conversational agents do not have instruments to deal with it. So they are not able to provide sufficient support for open-ended questions, right? Because often therapy starts with an open-ended question. What's wrong with me, right? Why am I sad? Why am I depressed? Why don't I feel any drive for life? Why don't I enjoy anything? So these are the questions which require deep analysis of the personal situation, and such deep cognitive involvement as understanding, connecting, or conceptualizing, actually getting the phenomenological transparency to emotions, so the thought patterns. All this is needed to find the reasons for it happening to me and not to cases described in literature, for example. So kind of trying to bypass one's own situation, which can happen in the interaction with conversational agents, may lead one feel irrelevant to the conversation or ignored. And the last point perhaps is that, conversational agents are to a certain extent epistemically inflexible, but what I mean by this, I didn't find a better word for that, so I just call it epistemical inflexibility. But what I mean is that, there are certain expectations that the patient is warranted to have from a therapeutic process and therapeutic dialogue. And it's important whether the kind of feedback, the kind of frustrations that the patients might have are significant. I do not say that they are always should be always taken as blaming the therapist. No, it's much more complex than that. But what I'm trying to say is that the patient might have a feeling or knowledge about which methods or which interpretations are right ones and helpful ones and which are not, right? And so these kind of feedbacks have to be a part of the therapeutic process, part of the healing. So there has to be space in which a patient is able to raise those concerns. And the problem with CAs is that there is no space, there is no possibility for this kind of, or they're much more severely limited and much more mediated to be taken into account. So, P, did I run out of time?
No, you're exactly on time.
Okay, can I then address one more thing?
Sure.
Sure. So I want to say something about some meaning objections, because that is something that a reviewer mentioned in my concerning my paper on ethnicity, and I thought that this is not so uncommon. So what I mean is that very often people say, but hey, okay, you're saying that, you know, it's impossible for somebody to reach meaning or kind of, you know, derive some kind of meaning from interaction with AI, which is not true. So I do not disagree with that. I think that meaning is, to a great extent, is subjective. Yeah, so it's something that we create on our own with a certain sort of, how to say, sort of input from outside. So it's not the problem that you do not reach some meaning. You can always arrive at some meaning, and any output of AI can be construed as meaningful under certain description. The problem, however, is whether that meaning is therapeutically sufficient for the kind of problem and the task that you have at hand. And the point I'm trying to say is that for the type of cases I'm having in mind, for the type of complex cases, the existential cases, what matters is not the open-ended meaning creation, right? I don't say that it's not important in therapy or never is important. I don't say anything like that. But I'm saying is that for certain cases, that's not the goal. The goal, it's a constrained process of discovery. It's a process of understanding why a particular event or a particular trigger is producing effects that persist beyond conscious control, right? Think about psychosomatics, right? About chronic pain, about recurring nightmares, about blood pressure problems, which do not, so all those physiological symptoms with which you go to the doctor and the doctor tells you, well, there's nothing wrong with you, it's all in your head. So these are things that are there, they're facts of your life, and no act of will can resolve. So this is a question with specific psychological answer. So why, the question of why I have those chronic pains, or why do I have those blood pressure episodes, these are answers with specific psychological answer, the same way as the Bryson's symptoms, you know, that she's describing, also have a specific psychological answer. And finding that one answer is not simply a matter of what an individual can project or on the partner in a conversation, right? There is a certain thing that can be got right or not right, and this is where I think one of the major constraints of AI in psychotherapeutical dialogical environment lies. Yep, thank you.